Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me first of all abuse a couple of, well, maybe 1 minute for special greetings to the founding father of the Bologna Declaration and the European and maybe even the OECD approach, Enrico Letta, good friend Enrico Letta. I think cannot be overestimated the importance of that Bologna Charter. Secondly, greet my former fellow colleagues at the OECD. I'm very proud to see that and happy to see that the excellent work the OECD does is continued. And of course, a special word of gratitude to Sergio Arzeni, Lamia also, for holding the standard very high in terms of quality and in terms of intensity of the work. And also special words of greetings to the people representing small and medium enterprises. The difference between politicians and SMEs is that we talk about entrepreneurship and they perform entrepreneurship, and so it's always good to have this in mind. And also hello to Josiane, who's a new brilliant member of the European Parliament, and looking forward to cooperation. The question on the comparison between the financial crisis and the current COVID crisis, well, let me start by two precautionary prudence remarks. Number one, the crisis is still unfolding, and so we should be prepared to unexpected developments, and it's always better to forecast the past than to forecast the future, so let's be conscious of that. Secondly, I think we should also have a bit of humility and humbleness when we assess present and future trends. I think a same meeting last year, or even at the beginning of this year in January, February, would have, of course, COVID out of our radar and would have a totally different tone of voice. So I think COVID-19 has also shown again the limits of the human capacity to really influence things that are coming from the outside, challenges we are confronted with. And I think also in policy assessment and in evaluation of policies, this should be at the core of our. It sounds like normal, but I think it's good to have this as a kind of precaution. So then I come to the comparison. Of course, there are a couple of common points. I would say the fact that the crisis came suddenly in both cases, although in terms of the financial crisis, I must say that already in 2008, there was not a real forecast. Beginning of 2008, the end of 2007, there were some lights that started to be shifting from green to orange, but still it was a sudden, unexpected crisis. And of course, COVID-19 is the example of a sudden crisis. In the case of the financial crisis, let's be fair, the disruption was more specific to some parts of the economy. It was, of course, the real estate market in the US that caused all the difficulties. But it was only a sign of a bubble that was exploding, and more deeply in the economy, there was the issue of all kinds of non-performing loans and in the real estate mortgages. The real estate market was hit, the financial market was hit, but it was only indirectly that there was an impact on trust of investors, confidence in the future of consumers. And so only indirectly there was an effect on the real economy. And although it was, to our appreciation then, it seemed to be unfolding in a very fast way, still when you compare it to COVID-19, it was an easier crisis to manage. And I say that with a lot of respect for all the people that have been engaged in managing the financial crisis, very difficult. But still, I think the crisis now is more sudden, is unfolding faster, is more global, is more systemic. When it comes to SMEs, I think that the financial crisis was impacting negatively things as already mentioned, the confidence and trust of investors and consumers, but closer to the SME, the access to capital, the, let's say, the relation with their banks, with their investors. Now it is really the whole of the supply and demand that is affected. The supply chains that are broken up suddenly, of course, the demand, and also just the fact to close. I think a very important part of the SMEs today in the world just suffer from the fact that they cannot open their doors. They cannot be active anymore. Of course, there are big differences from sector to sector, but systemically all over the place, this is really hitting now the core of the activity of SMEs, where the financial crisis was more, let's say, indirectly. And as I mentioned already before, one big difference is the difference in sectors that are hit. I think that now tourism, travel, but also let's say the very small auto-entrepreneurship and very small enterprises are more hit than with the financial crisis. The financial crisis was also more geographically uneven, with, I think, a lot of parts of Asia just not hit by the crisis of 2008, 2011. This time, mostly all parts of the world are hit, as we can witness, or as we don't witness today. Because I think in the statistics, the figures, but OECD could elaborate on that better than I can do, but that there's a lot of there are a lot of developments and effects, impacts of the COVID crisis that are still hidden because of the lack of really very well-performing statistical instruments that lack in some parts of the world. In terms of timing, so geographically, I think it's wider spread now. In terms of timeline, personally, I am a little bit more optimistic, but of course, with a lot of humility, I'm not a super expert. But I think the sequence of the financial crisis that went from a crisis in confidence and trust to an impact on the financial system, then an impact on the real economy, from the real economy on social security schemes, and from the social security schemes to public expenditure, to debt, and so on. This took us 3 to 4 or 5 years to adapt. And one could say that even in terms of regulatory framework and in terms of, let's say, solving the debt increase that was caused by the financial crisis, we're still trying to cope with lots of challenges related to that. So let's say the timeline of the effects of the financial crisis, I think, will be longer than the one of COVID-19. Certainly if let's say the optimistic information we got, the news we got beginning of this week and last week about the vaccine, certainly if that really appears to be close to reality, and we have to be very prudent there, but I think that the timeline could be shorter of this COVID-19 crisis. It won't be a V development. I think it will be an U, and maybe a U with one of the legs a bit more, not really vertical, but still I would say in terms of tourism that it could be, let's say, not so long than in the case of the financial crisis. I think for the positioning of the SMEs, and then I close with a couple of words on public authorities, the way SMEs will regain traction in terms of their activities as such, in terms also of making profit, will depend on their capacity to, let's say, to address two windows that are affecting their competitiveness. Number one, I think the degree to which the SMEs will grab the window of, fill the window of opportunity, use the window of opportunity to increase the productivity, to benefit from productivity gains. It is clear that as a reaction to the impact on the core of the activities of the SMEs, there has been a lot of cost cutting more spectacularly in terms of, for instance, travel, in terms of all kinds of costs that are related to entrepreneurship. And so I think it is important for SMEs to seize the opportunity of having to cut all these costs, to see when they come again to, let's say, running their business as it was before the crisis, whether they can structurally include these cost savings that are not temporarily imposed by the circumstances, if they can include them in kind of a 360-degree review of the way they function. And that goes for their own activities, but also the way they do their outreach to potential consumers, their outreach to potential clients. Number two, in terms of the product itself, I think that crisis has shown, COVID crisis, that in terms of customization, in terms of answering the needs of clients and consumers, there is still some progress to make, and there are still some opportunities that can be grabbed by SMEs, maybe even in a more flexible way than the real big shots and the real big companies. So customization, more specific services, more specific products adapted to the reality of and the demands of consumers, I think there could be a speeding up of a normal development that we see in the, let's say, the changes in attitude, services and products, the changes in the offer of products. Other aspect early is digitalization. There's a lot of digitalization that was forced now on SMEs, forced on their employees. Will they continue to use all these ICT tools also in the future? And will they have the courage to just scrap, to just delete some expenditure that was there before the COVID-19 crisis, and that now, under the impact of the COVID-19 crisis, was just swiped out? For example, of course, the COVID crisis has shown some new needs in the field of caregiving, in the field of pharmaceuticals, in the field of how people organize their daily lives, how travel is approached, and so on. Will our SMEs really grab all the chances and opportunities to engineer new services, to engineer new answers to the demands? I think for bigger companies, the COVID-19 crisis could turn out maybe a bit more difficult to cope with. For instance, take an example, the car industry. Already before the COVID-19 crisis, the car industry was facing lots of challenges in terms of transformation of the product, transformation of the business. All these problems, all these troubles have not disappeared now in the COVID-19 crisis, but it will be more difficult for them to address them, and there will have to be a lot of investment in response to that. Last element to answer your comparison question is, and I think that comes very close to the activities of the OECD, is the multilateral response to the crisis. I was thinking this morning of an anecdote I lived through when I indeed had the privilege to sit in the cockpit of the financial crisis. I remember that the first informal meeting organized by Nicolas Sarkozy, that was chairing the EU Council in the second half of 2008. Nicolas organized a meeting, informal European Council at the Élysée, to have a conversation with Eurozone members to see how we could, in an informal exchange of views, how we could address the challenges. And I remember that on behalf of the Benelux, and together with other colleagues, I put on the table the question of a collective European reaction to the financial crisis. And one should remember that at that time, member states of the Eurozone were hit differently by what was coming over from the US. This time it came over from China, and then it came over from the US. And that after our interventions, that there was an immediate reaction by Angela Merkel, Nicolas Sarkozy, and so on. And they said, literally, I consulted my notes this morning, we don't have the political space now today, Yves, to exchange on a real European answer to this financial and banking crisis and to this crisis that is coming over from the US. We are talking then of the first half of October 2008. And I say that with a lot of empathy and understanding, because indeed it was politically, there was no, let's say, sufficient momentum to already then engineer a European response. And so it has taken us, and you can read a lot of books on this period now, it has taken us in the European Union, in the Eurozone, for instance, it has taken us, I think, 2 to 3 years' time to strengthen the prudential controls, to agree on packages and access to credits and low emergency loans and so on in the case of Greece, Portugal, Ireland, and some other measures. So it has taken us as a multilateral system 2 to 3 years. I would say that although at first sight it seems at least maybe even worse than then, I would say that the multilateral system has been more active in responding to the challenges. I think the first weeks didn't show a very good reaction by the European Union. That is sometimes big on small and small on big. And this time it seemed at the beginning that the European Union again would be very small in answering this very big challenge. But still, as was rightly underlined by Enrico Letta, I think the package that has been decided since this summer, also other initiatives that the President of the European Commission has taken, also the kind of debates we see in the European Parliament and within the Council, have shown that within the year after the crisis, there is indeed a political will and measures are taken. So that about the response by the authorities. I'm not so well placed to talk about the response by public authorities in other parts of the world. Let me just add one sentence. I think in terms of the multilateral system, we should not underestimate the risk in the coming years. And there I think the OECD can play a crucial role for a development to a more split world, where you have the US and China developing their own standards, developing their own approaches, and where the European Union kind of falls between two chairs. And I'm not only talking about the reality today of the Asian Samsung and the Chinese production and the US production and the two standards in 5G and so on. It's broader than that. And I think that there the OECD has a meeting point of the industrialized world, but also with lots of working parties, including participation of also non-OECD members. And also the methodology of the OECD can help the world to prepare the economies to better answer the challenges than we did starting from the financial crisis. I close here and I'm looking forward also to the Q&A that will follow. Thank you very much.